For this video, we want to give you a quick overview of some of the funding opportunities available to help you both launch your apprenticeship program and also hopefully sustain and scale your apprenticeship program. So the good news with apprenticeship funding is that there is quite a lot of both apprenticeship funding and also workforce development funding that is out there both at the state and the federal level. The slightly less good news is that we recognize that it can be a little bit tricky to navigate. So I'm hoping in this video to give you a sense of where you might focus your energies based on the type of entity you are and also based on like what stage of your program you're in. So in navigating the world of possible apprenticeship funding, we've tried to kind of separate it into three different categories, which is funding that is really specific to apprenticeships. So of course, I'll focus a little bit more on that here. There's also what we call apprenticeship adjacent funding, which is funding sources that are often used for apprenticeship or pre-apprenticeship, but are not specifically for that purpose. And then there's the apprenticeship possible funding sources, which really taps into the broader world of workforce development funding in a certain sector or serving a certain population, and how that could potentially be used to support and scale your apprenticeship program. So one thing I will say before I dive into any more of this is that we have recently updated the DAS website with a whole lot of links. So if I offer a funding source here today and you're like, oh, I want to learn more about that, please go to our website and you can follow these links on our website to get more information about each of these funding sources and how you might tap into it. So first, I want to dive into the apprenticeship specific funding, because of course, this is going to be the most relevant to you as you're developing and scaling your apprenticeship program. So we here at DAS administer a number of funding sources. The Chancellor's Office, the California Community College Chancellor's Office, also administers some important funding sources around apprenticeship, and ETP and Department of Labor also play an important role in funding apprenticeship. So I'm going to touch a little bit more on each of these, but these give you a sense of the different funding here in California that's really focused entirely on apprenticeship. And so to dive a little bit more into each of these, and I've focused my lens a little bit thinking about apprenticeship programs that are outside of the building and fire trades, because I know that's where a lot of new program development is. But that overview slide I just showed you kind of gives you the full picture, and I'm curating a little bit on the details here to try to be most helpful to this audience, which I'm presuming is starting new programs and also specifically in the community college ecosystem. So first, and this is a new funding source, is the Apprenticeship Innovation Funding. And this is a new source of funding to really support running apprenticeship programs and also training apprentices. And $55 million has been invested into this in this budget year that we're in now, which is 22-23. And I'll dive into some more details on this because I want to make sure you are aware of this one. Another new funding source that could be relevant to getting new programs going is the California Youth Apprenticeship Grant Program. And that's $20 million in funding this year. And this is really focused on trying to create pathways for opportunity youth into pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship. A longer standing source of funding is the California Apprenticeship Initiative grants, which are $30 million in this year's budget cycle. And it's specifically for the planning, implementation, and expansion of new apprenticeship programs. So I would definitely point people towards learning more about this area, because this can be really helpful startup funding to get a new program up and running, both in the planning stages and in that launch phase. Related and supplemental instruction is one of the more long-standing ways that the state of California has invested into apprenticeship, and this is $8.82 per training hour. The Employment Training Panel also has apprenticeship-specific funding that is for the training specifically of upskilling incumbent workers. So if that makes sense for your program, I would recommend exploring that. And then USDOL also has grants that typically come out every spring. The most recent round has had an emphasis on teacher apprenticeships, but I would encourage folks to look annually. Typically it's in the spring that DOL grants come out. Now, as we look at apprenticeship adjacent funding, we sort of expand the aperture of potential funding. There is a lot of different categories of funding in here. And I'll call out a few of them, but again, I wanted to kind of give you the broader list so that you can take a look at this. And if there are ones that seem most relevant to your program, you can double click on them by going to the website and literally double clicking on those. But just to highlight a few that I think might be most relevant in the community college context. So we have community college apportionment funding. So this, of course, is not specific to apprenticeship. This is how education, how that full-time equivalent student funding happens in community colleges. But what's very important is that if an apprentice is enrolled in 4 credit classes in community colleges, their tuition fees are waived, and that cost is picked up by the state of California. So we definitely want to be seeing more and more apprenticeship programs be utilizing this FTES funding. In addition, there is strong workforce funding that of course goes to community colleges and K-12s to try to encourage the creation of work-based learning programs, which we believe really could be leveraged more and more to develop apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship programs, and also to potentially be part of that ongoing support equation. Another really interesting and important source of funding around apprenticeship is the Learning Aligned Employment Program, which is administered by the California Student Aid Commission. And this is actually $500 million that's gone towards essentially a work-study program, but it's one of the few funding sources that can offset wages. And this has been deployed through the different LEAs, the community colleges, the CSUs, and the UCs. So to the extent that you are connected to one of those, this could be a wage offset program, which is very exciting. So I wanted to be sure to touch on that today. And then SURF funding is another, the Community Economic Resilience Fund is another source of funding that is a pretty big pot of funding that's been being deployed in the regions to think about economic resilience. And I think, again, apprenticeship could be a big piece of that equation. In terms of, so, continuing on this thread of apprenticeship adjacent funding, I would encourage you to look towards foundations. I've listed a few foundations here that I know have invested in apprenticeship historically. And of course, the EDA and DOL typically, like I mentioned, provide those grants. Usually it's in the springtime. It's typically in the range of like $1 to $10 million. And sometimes there'll be a bit of an occupation focus, but I encourage you to check out those grants because that, of course, can help you get going. In addition, WIOA funding through the workforce development boards can be utilized in the apprenticeship context. In addition, here in California, the California Workforce Development Board has created the High Road Training Partnerships framework around funding new programs. And so this, I would encourage folks to check this out, especially if there's, to the extent that like worker voice is incorporated into your program, that's part of that High Road framework. It's also looking at trying to support careers into high quality jobs. And so I think this can be a great source of funding for new programs. And then the California Youth Leadership Corps Earn and Learn Pathways is another great source of funding, especially for youth-oriented programs. Which brings me to this final slide, which really expands the aperture to apprenticeship possible funding. I don't want to dive into all of this. It would take me a very long time to dive into all of this. This is just to give you a sense of, there's a lot of funding out there, like I said at the top, around certain sectors, certain populations. And so I would encourage you to follow the links on this one, pull the thread that you think is most relevant to you based on the sector that you're in or the populations that you might be serving. And like I said at the top, there's a lot of funding out there for workforce development. And I think that apprenticeship is really the gold standard of workforce development. It creates that earn and learn pathway. So I believe it's going to give you positive points towards any of these funding sources. And I would encourage you, again, to check out our website to further understand these resources.